age, but crucially, like we've been discussing with the idea of the Learning to Learn week, crucially, all that relies on the feeling that they have as they walk into the school, that the school is providing everything they need to be able to thrive. And that's what I think is really essential to establish at the beginning of the year, before they meet all the learning. So they have all the tools. It's like they all carry this, they feel they're carrying this physical toolbox with them throughout the year. So like a person that comes to do any job with a toolbox, they open the toolbox and take out the right tool for the right.
The first week, generally, that's what changes everything in a classroom. Welcome back to In My Kitchen with Yvonne and our Staff Room Stories series. This is where we talk about how to build better communities with the school, and we put the school front and center of everything. We also sometimes do get to talk about some of the things that are going on. And so generally at the minute, a lot of the conversations are around money and, schools being heavily under-resourced. But there's also ways in which we can help our teachers do things better. And one of the things that come up a lot in the past has been AI. Pop in the chat where you're joining us from, when you're watching this. We'd love to know. Also, pop in the chat. Are you a school? Are you calling from a school? What's your role? Are you a teacher? Are you in SLT? Are you a head? And be honest, who's actually on a lunch break and who's hiding somewhere with a cold coffee? So just before we get started, let me start with this. Most classrooms don't struggle because of behavior. They struggle because of what happens in the first week. I know that I used to be that classroom and I used to be that teacher, and especially when I was really earlier on in my teaching career. A lot of us as educators will spend months planning curriculum, but we rush the one moment that actually sets the culture for the classroom, because it doesn't always seem that important until it is. So today we're asking, what if your first week of the school is the most important thing a teacher actually designs? If you've been there, drop in the chat. Do you feel that first week needs to be intentional? Do you feel yours is usually intentional? Or do you sometimes feel it's really, really rushed? Few minutes, your class has walked in, boom, you tell them, this is what I expect from you, and you get going into the first topic. Now, my guest in the kitchen today is Marcelo. Marcelo has developed a really simple but powerful idea. He calls it Learning to Learn Week. So exciting. I can't wait to get into it. It's a way of starting the year by not jumping straight into your content, but by teaching students how to think, how to question, and most importantly, how to learn. What I love about this is it's not about resources, it's about better design. Marcelo, welcome to my kitchen.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. It's a great honor and a great privilege to be in your kitchen this lunchtime. I'm so looking forward to our time together and the discussion in the next hour or so. Thank you so much for inviting me.
And me too. Before we started recording, we were talking about something that really has stayed with me. We were talking about philosophy, not just as a subject, but as a way of thinking in the classroom. And how is it from as early as primary school, we can actually start helping children to just learn how to question things and also how to think?
That's a fascinating question, Yvonne. And as we're discussing, I think my love for introducing very, very young children to philosophical discussions and philosophical thinking has emanated from my previous career as a research scientist. So my first degree was at Sussex as a scientist, and then I followed a career as a research scientist for many years. I then retrained as a primary school teacher when I was 30, so quite late on, and loved every single minute of it since. Then became a primary school teacher and head teacher, and now I'm an assistant professor in education at the University of Sussex. And in between whilst being a head teacher and a teacher, I developed a very special philosophy of education and of school leadership, which has now become known as the joy of not knowing. And it's wonderfully been published as a book with that title by Routledge in 2021. So I am really, really pleased to be sharing lots of ideas from the book with you today, Yvonne, with everyone listening during the lunchtime. In terms of philosophy itself, I think what's really, really exciting, and I think it's a real kind of responsibility in a way for all teachers, is to nurture what I think is what's innate to children. So I believe that children are born philosophical. So when children are born, I just think that they're born innately wanting to find out about things, to ask the big questions, to work out how everything works. I just think, children are always asking questions and are always asking ways, always trying to find out how things relate to their lives and how the world functions, how the world, that's just how young children are. And I think the combination of that plus the formation of myself with a research scientist background was a really fascinating mixture when coming into the classroom. And a research scientist, as we were saying, are fascinated by questions that don't have answers, because that's what they do. They're all trying to find solutions to problems that the world still doesn't have an answer to. That's the role of a research scientist. And when I came into education, it was exactly the same. I wanted children to feel really, really comfortable with with not knowing, with that sense of wanting to find out, that sense of real curiosity, that sense of always wanting to use the knowledge that they have to discover new knowledge.
And your journey itself has been an interesting one as well, isn't it? Because how you got to what you're doing, you started, as a scientist. You didn't start in the classroom, as you said. You came in quite late in your 30s. You already had an established career, and then you came in, and you didn't just step into a classroom. You actually ended up being a head teacher. And a head teacher of 2 schools,
Yes.
from the conversation that we had. And then from there, that wasn't enough. It's that curiosity that you yourself hold. You then went, and said, I want to learn more about these little beings. That's the word you said when we were talking, these little beings in front of me. And you said, I want to be able to also help other people do a good job when they're working with these little things. And then you then entered back into university to be able to train upcoming teachers, right?
That's correct. Yeah, it feels very full circle now. Yes, absolutely. Yes. But what I noticed very early on in my career as a teacher and then as a head teacher is that when one develops classrooms that start to function as communities of inquiry, which is what philosophical discussions are all based upon, you start to develop all the characteristics and all the values and all the skills that I think are really important and are really at the core of the purpose of education. So when you have these, like you say, these amazing little beings in front of you, you're shaping them as effective lifelong learners. So with that ability to to think creatively, to think critically, to live, within that set of co-constructed values, democratic processes, or all those sorts of things. I think are absolutely amazingly exciting to develop in the classroom. And what they do is they mimic the outside world. So it's what you're then able to create as a teacher is a kind of a microcosm of society within the classroom. And really, really interestingly, Yvonne, both the schools that I was becoming a head teacher of, I took away all the rules. So there were no rules in the school, but we just lived through a set of values, which is sort of mimicking society.
And it takes a lot of bravery for
Yeah.
a leader to be able to do this. So I can imagine the first, just as we're discussing today, the first week and the challenges that brings. I can imagine the challenges of taking away. I mean, teachers, one of the things we thrive under is structure. So I can imagine taking away, it's almost like that, what's the word, that crutch that we're used to.
Yes.
I'm going to be told to do this, and then all I have to do is follow. And
Yes.
almost saying, okay, right, we are having a new philosophy where everybody is going to demonstrate within their classrooms what it means to think, because essentially that's what you've introduced.
Yes.
And this is a nice, natural way for us to maybe pivot a little bit into your book, because this is where the idea of learning to learn comes from. Could you tell us a little bit about your book, the book that you've just published?
Yes.
And also maybe in this first segment, as we step into this first segment, let's look at the problem. Why classrooms struggle early. So let's start from there. What's going wrong in most classrooms in those first few weeks?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question and take. Yeah, so this is a lovely book. It's called The Joy of Not Knowing, and the reason behind the title, which may seem a little bit against what we're used to in education, where people are always seeking knowledge, is that it conveys a very special message to children from very early on, from 3 and 4 year olds is when they're introduced to this, and that is that if you think about the process of learning, in order to learn anything new, we have to not know it first. Yeah, so it tries to challenge that way of thinking, or perception of that children have of school, where they feel that they come into school, teacher's going to ask lots of questions, and you only succeed if you can put your hand up and know the answer. Yeah, do you know that sense of the drive that can drive education through only feeling happy and satisfied if you know the answer to the question the teacher's asking. So I wanted to try and sort of reverse that a little bit and actually say, well, if you're actually answering the question the teacher's asking, you're really not learning anything new because you already knew it. So I've developed this whole idea of introducing the children to the joy of not knowing through the model of the learning pit, which you might have come across, first introduced to me by the wonderful James Nottingham. And within that, children start to realize that in order to learn something new, you have to not know it first. So if you know it, you can jump across the pit, but if you don't know it, you go into the pit. And within the pit, when you're inside, that's where you do all your learning, all your dispositions of effective learning, your characteristics, working with friends, asking questions, everything that enables you to succeed with a problem happens within the pit, and then when you come out, you come out with new knowledge. But what's really interesting is that both learners that know the answer and don't know the answer start to a question, in the same place at the top and finish in the same place across on the other side of the pit. But they finish as extremely different learners, because the one that's jumped across and knew the answer, was really happy, has got to that stage without having learned anything new. Whereas the one that went through the whole process of the pit, discovered the answer to the problem, and has come out on the other side, they've come out with new knowledge. And that means that new knowledge is accompanied by a set of new questions, because they're asking questions. So their curiosity, based on the new knowledge that they have, is what then drives the excitement in the classroom. So that sense of promoting questions from the new knowledge that you have is what keeps that really exciting cycle of learning, and that what I call the intrinsic motivation to want to learn.
And that's really powerful. Would you say some of the way in which we set up that new classroom and this idea of just teaching those little ones, or those young ones, that learning is actually, like you said, learning is actually a journey? Is that why that first week is so important? These are the kind of things that we're looking at teaching. And what is the problem with our current approach?
Yes, absolutely, Yvonne. What's really interesting is when you see the diagram of the pit and the children inside the pit doing the learning, what you start to realize is that it takes a lot of bravery and courage and motivation and enthusiasm for the children to go from the top, from realizing they don't know, to start, first of all, to launch into the learning process, and then to actually function inside the pit when they're doing their learning. So if that's what education is, acquiring new knowledge and going through that learning process, then I started to think that what's really, really, really critical are the conditions that the children find themselves in whilst they are in the pit doing their learning. And then I started to think that those conditions I wanted to set before we introduce the actual knowledge, the actual process of learning. So, it's, for example,
doing a setup, so you bring them along the journey.
Yes. So, for example, yesterday we had a British gas came to fix our boiler, and what I was really pleased with is that before he came, he had all the tools, all the knowledge, all the expertise to be able to fix the boiler properly, rather than coming and saying, let's just have a go now and see how things go. So the idea of equipping the children with all they need before they start to learn, all the tools, all the strategies, all the culture that's going to make them thrive, is really fascinating to set all that up within a dedicated week at the start of the academic year. And many schools now, I'm really delighted to say, are dedicating that first week of the academic year to develop within each school totally differently, because the Jar of Not Now approach is not prescriptive at all. It just builds on what people are already doing, all the expertise that they have, and within each one's context. The idea is that schools spend the first week or so nominal 5 days, first of all setting the culture in the classroom and co-constructing that culture, using democratic processes of voting for the values that they will all have, that live with in the classroom for the rest of the year, the children's rights that they will adhere to, the sustainable development goals that will be real parts of the learning process. And also, Yvonne, really interestingly, the shape and structure, the physical shape of the classroom. So, what is really fantastic is to develop the seating arrangement that's based on a horseshoe shape rather than on individual group tables. Because in a horseshoe shape, what you get is all children sitting all facing the front, so there aren't any children facing backwards, but also it gives them all a sense of real equality. Everyone is equal in that scenario, and everyone can hear and listen to each other's contributions when everybody's speaking. So the physical structure of the classroom is co-constructed in that week. The culture within which everyone will live through for the whole year is set up during that week, and that's co-constructed through democratic voting of values. And then what's also really exciting during that week is that you start to introduce them to ideas that develop that they'll be able to use to engage with the curriculum, developing their creative thinking, their visible thinking and learning process, their philosophical thinking, and also the fifth day is devoted to introducing them to the wonders of the lifelong learning disposition. So they're introduced to the ideas of being resilient, of being curious, of being creative, of being collaborative. So by the end of the week, what happens is that this is the key to the whole podcast today, Yvonne, they feel that they have everything they need to be able to thrive socially, academically, cognitively, linguistically, culturally. And they feel that there's no guarantee that they will all be able to succeed. But what I value so much is the feeling that they all leave that first week with, is that they feel able to thrive. And I think that's what then contributes to the intrinsic motivation that they all come with every single day when they meet the curriculum, and are really then happy to engage because they feel that the classroom is providing them with everything they need to be able to thrive. And when you combine that with the celebration of not knowing, it's fantastic because the children, all the barriers just are completely removed because they feel, oh, it's brilliant to not know. I love not knowing. I'm just going to take my time and engage with the learning in my own way, so that eventually I will get to the answer and solve the problem. But there are two other really, really exciting things that happen on day one or day two of the Learning to Learn week. The first one is that they're introduced to this concept of the joy of not knowing. So they're all on day one really, really happy with not knowing, which is fantastic. But the other thing is that on day one, they create what's called joy of not knowing personalized model of learning. So every single child on day one develops a model which describes how they view learning themselves. So it's a unique model for every child. So it could be something like, like planting a seed. You plant it, you have to water it, and eventually it grows, and that's when you've learned. Or it could be something like going to a maze. You go in, you don't know where the exit is. You get stuck, you have to start again, but eventually you find your way out. All sorts of things. The children are so creative at thinking. What that does is that it provides, by the end of the first day, they draw their individual models, they write about them, they explain them, and then the teacher puts them up on the wall before they go home on day one. So the first day in the classroom, they go home feeling that the teacher has really recognized them and valued them all equally as learners.
So the first week they've actually already started to engage with the process of knowing and learning how to learn. Would you say what I'm hearing is uh, some of the problems that come up, and maybe why we sometimes, as educators, might feel quite rushed, is potentially not even understanding, the
Mm.
importance of having this setup, and
Mm.
potentially also having embedded cultures,
Mm.
around what it means to learn. And so what the joy of not knowing that first week, that learning to learn week is, I'm hearing, is even more important for the educators
Mm.
because they're
Mhm.
creating their community.
Exactly.
So it's worth having, and what I was furiously writing down as you were talking is worth having a framework,
Mm.
to be able to develop those stages, but also because it's a fluid framework, it's
Mhm.
something that you can turn and make it into your own. So I think this takes us into
Yes.
a really powerful way to go into the second segment, that framework, that learning
Mm.
to learn week. And you just started talking about that. So let's get into the framework that you've developed.
Yes.
If you could say in very few words, as few words as you can, what
Mm.
is it and why is it important to have this framework for that first week?
Mm. I think it establishes a mutual sense of purpose.
Mm,
That's the principle that I think it establishes the conditions in which children feel able to learn, but also establishes the culture that enables children to realize that the teacher is a co-learner. So everything is set up so that everyone feels equal. So the teacher and the children are all in this process together. And it really establishes a sense of value, of the teacher valuing the children as individuals and as learners. So I believe that the key to education is how a child feels that the teacher feels about them.
yes, yeah. Learn, um, children learn when they know you care. I've heard that
Exactly.
said before.
Exactly.
They want to know you care before, they will actually mm, start. Well, culturally as well. There's a lot of
Yes.
like cultural, I think,
Yes.
perspective. My
Yes.
question was going to be as well. Does the joy of learning and that learning to learn week apply more for a kind of different setting? Maybe does it work better in primary school than it would in secondary school? Would it work in a setting where, for example, there was less behavioral, issues? Are there certain settings where it might not work? Is where I'm going with this.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Yvonne, as well. It works absolutely brilliantly in primary settings because
Mm.
we have the privilege of having the class, the same children, the same class all the time. So we have that whole week and we can devote that time and just be together and build all the things that will then drive successful learning during the year.
Mm.
Very interestingly, I am working alongside various people in secondary school to try and develop a secondary model. Now, the secondary model is a little bit more tricky because the students move from one
Class.
class to another
Yeah.
every
I
hour
was
or
going
so.
to ask, and that was actually going to be my follow-up. Would the secondary school model need to be a whole school approach then for it
Exactly.
to work? So
Yeah.
every single educator
Yes.
in the whole
Exactly.
school is using the same model,
Exactly.
every
So
single class they go to.
yeah, exactly. So what we're working on, I'm working a lot of work with a school in Brighton called Backer,
Mm.
um, and we're trying to establish a model for secondary education, learning to learn works. And what we are, the route that we're taking is that as children move from one subject to another and they meet that subject teacher for the first time, the focus is during that first session is to introduce the children and encourage them to develop the skills that makes them think like a scientist or think like a linguist or think like a mathematician. or think like a historian. So all the strategies that enable children to think, develop their creative and critical and philosophical thinking based on that subject is really, really, really exciting, because then every teacher introduces the children to the kind of the same sort of concepts, but within, but in a way that's related to their subject. So they're all doing the same ethos, values, but specialized, detailing it, especially to their subject. And I think that's such an amazing challenge.
It is, and it you know what is really beautiful about that, I think, when I was teaching, I remember there was this idea where we were teaching based on real life, and if we could introduce that into the subject, there was a much higher likelihood that the students would engage better. And I remember just before I left teaching, the government had actually introduced careers into all of all the different subjects. So as you taught, you are able to relate to the career that they could get into, as you're teaching the subject. And then what I'm hearing from what you're saying here is you're actually bringing that philosophy into this angle as well, right?
Yes.
So if you're thinking like a mathematician, and without question, that means this is the kind of model that a mathematician would be doing. It's not just if you're answering statistics, if you're answering statistics because a mathematician would answer statistics in a certain way. And that's really, really interesting. So in order for this to work in a primary setting, then, would you say secondary setting, would you say certain schools are more likely set up? For example, now with the introduction of things like AI, would a school, that is more focused on what jobs would you have in the future, and therefore how should you be thinking if AI is going to be coming into the mix, answering these basic level questions? What would a mathematician of the future need to be thinking like?
Exactly. So that's really interesting, Yvonne. But one of the fifth day of the Learning to Learn week is dedicated to what's called the lifelong learning dispositions, and that's where we, as educators, try to instill, through the teaching of the curriculum, through the normal everyday teaching and learning process, we try to instill and develop children who become effective lifelong learners. So it's not children who just acquire knowledge related to the lesson, but as they acquire that knowledge, they develop a very deep understanding of that knowledge. And then through challenge and conversations around, like you say, applications to real life, they develop wisdom that enables them to then use that knowledge for the good of society. And it's a really interesting aspect of the Joy of Not Knowing approach, that it promotes the idea that knowledge is not just enough, or knowledge is irrelevant really, unless it's accompanied by understanding and then the wisdom to use it. So when you combine that idea with the idea of introducing the children, so what does make a person effective as a learner for life, a lifelong learning, an effective lifelong learner, then you start to discuss with them the 6 attributes that came out of a project that I was involved with the University of Bristol and Guy Claxton. So they're things like curiosity, strategic awareness, creativity, collaboration, resilience. So you offer those definitions and those ideas to the students as part of the Learning to Learn week. And those can be very, very much in secondary schools apply to the way that they relate to each individual subject. And what we developed as well, which is really interesting, is the opposites of those. So for example, if if you're looking at being resilient, the opposite of that is being fragile. So you fall apart whenever anything gets difficult or hard or something you can't do. You fall apart and you give up. And by creating the opposites, children or students are able to map themselves along that continuum from what you want to achieve to the other extreme. And then during the year, they move that mapping more and more towards the resilient side, for example. So there's so much scope in terms of making it applicable to their futures, to their careers, to their lives. And what I always say, Yvonne, is that I think the purpose of education is to instill in children the thought, and students, the thought that anything and everything is possible. Yeah, I used to be the head of Hertford Infants Nursery School. My first headship, which was really special, it was in the 10th most deprived area of England in terms of the statistics. And now I'm meeting students and families from then, and they are at Oxford doing philosophy, and in Cambridge doing economics, and in Bristol doing medicine. It's just amazing what one can, the transformation that one can achieve when you start with them at a very little age, because they all started with me at 3. And with this kind of idea of removing the worry, the fear of not knowing, but replacing that with a sense of excitement, security, curiosity, enthusiasm to engage, but crucially, like we've been discussing with the idea of the Learning to Learn week, crucially, all that relies on the feeling that they have as they walk into the school, that the school is providing everything they need to be able to thrive. And that's what I think is really essential to establish at the beginning of the year, before they meet all the learning. So they have all the tools. It's like they all carry this, they feel they're carrying this physical toolbox with them throughout the year. So like a person that comes to do any job with a toolbox, they open the toolbox and take out the right tool for the right process that they need to do. So they carry this nominal learning to learn toolbox with them all year round, so they feel that safety in terms of being able to just to tackle anything, but also removing the worry that they have to achieve everything first time. So that learning takes time. Yeah.
So we're not saying that we're going against what Maslow says in terms of making sure the basics are in place. Yes, the school is going to provide the basics, right? So your food, shelter, and clothing. We all know that that first base level has to be in place. We're saying the next level, the level that gets them engaging. We want to set that up within that first week. Exactly. We want to give them that emotional safety. Exactly. We want to give them the freedom for having that cognitive safety. And once that is set up, then your learners stop seeing you as an adversary in the classroom. I like the word you use. There's something you say there. You're establishing a mutual sense of purpose, because you've established a culture where the teacher is a co-learner. Exactly. So you're bringing them in to be part of that community that you say.
Exactly. And I'll give you a little example that will be brilliant at this stage, Yvonne, because it combines the idea of philosophy and common co-construction of learning. And that is the idea which I hope will be one of the big takeaways for our wonderful listeners today. The idea of presenting the learning to the children, so presenting the learning objective or the learning intention as a question rather than as a statement. So I'll give you an example. So for example, if you're studying the properties of 2D shape, it's very common for schools to say the learning intention today, or the learning objective, is to be able to learn about the properties of two-dimensional shape, for example. If you change that into, can we analyze or can we investigate the properties of 2D shape, is amazing, because the teacher and the children are all together trying to see what you can find out about what you're about to learn. So the can we is so simple but so powerful. But then even more amazing is if you launch with a learning objective that says, do two-dimensional shapes exist?
Yes, and a lot of schools might be listening. If I had more money, if I had more money, I'd have less behavioral problems, because we tend to start from that place, right? The reason we are having a lot of problems or troubles is because we're in a deprived area. What you're saying is you can actually establish this without the need to go and look for more. You're not saying money cannot be a problem, because we all know that schools are underfunded in some elements, but you're saying let's find a way to creatively solve the learner's curiosity. So they become part of the learning, part of the journey. And it doesn't matter what the conditions might be, we can start from those basics.
Exactly. And I've got a fantastic story that really shaped my career from very early on. When I was early on my career, I was a teacher at Westbury Park Primary School in Bristol. And I had an amazing head teacher, Alan Rees, who, was really, really keen to promote all these wonderful cultures in the school. So we started to do a lot of philosophy in the school. And he once came to my classroom. He said, Marcelo, since we started doing philosophy in your class and in the school, he said, you know what's happened? The queue that I used to have every lunchtime outside my office, after every lunchtime, has now disappeared. So he said, every lunch, after every lunchtime, he used to have a queue of children outside his office because of misbehavior or fighting, or, all those sorts of things. He said, they've completely disappeared, because through the values, he was the one that really introduced me to values-led education, and then all the work that we did on philosophy. He said the children are now able to discuss things with each other. They're able to talk through problems. They're able to reason. So it was an amazing direct bit of evidence, real powerful evidence of the impact that this kind of culture can have.
And that's why I think something you say there. You mentioned the effects of starting with these nursery school children, who then end up, because of them learning how to think, and of course there was some good teaching that had to take place in between there for them to end up there, but because the foundations, right, the foundational thinking process had been introduced, they're able to develop a way in which they become curious learners. I think that was the word that you said, like you build curiosity into it. And this is a really good way for us to segue into our third segment, which we're going to look at the shift, moving from, I love what you said, you took away all the rules from the school. I can imagine the chaos at the beginning. You've got to be brave to do that. So let's look at that shift. How do we go from control to actually culture? So one thing I always hear, when speaking to head teachers, this week we were at a leadership event, and there's lots of head teachers, and a lot of them are saying we have a lot less resources, and we're really trying to control the behavior. And what I'm hearing from you, you're not trying to control behavior. What you're saying is, at school, let's introduce a way where we can build a system where behavior settles itself. Just this
exactly
that you mentioned.
Exactly, is living together through a set of values was my behavior policy.
You're building your community, right?
Yes.
So what changes when a classroom is built this way?
But there was very a couple of very important points here.
Yeah.
The values were all voted by all the children, all the families, and all the staff. So democratic voting, and then the top 6 in an actual election became our school values. So everyone had a say originally. What they weren't imposed, yeah. But then we used the
Marcelo, that is
values.
very African, right? So in
Yes.
African culture, in the village, that's how things used to work. Long ago. That's how it works, you know.
Yeah.
And that we had this idea where it takes a village. And what I'm hearing from you is you're creating the village was actually the one coming up with all this.
Exactly. But also there's a really kind of very important point here, that the values became the behavior policy, because if something went wrong, and things would go wrong all the time, we would use that language. So we would say that wasn't very caring. So caring was one of our values. Or that wasn't very respectful. Or that wasn't very thoughtful. And the because the language of discussion when things went wrong matched the language of the values that the culture were trying to, it became a really, really powerful way of managing. I don't like the word behavior, but ways of being together.
Yeah, so you're engaging together rather than,
Yes.
top down.
Yes, exactly. So
what would some of the hesitation, what would you imagine some of the hesitation of a head teacher who's, used to having that element of, control? What would some of the hesitation be for introducing something like this?
Yes, I would say that the hesitation may come from the fact that they may think that certain things some messages may not be transmitted clearly enough to some children if you don't have rules that say, do not run, or do not talk, or loudly, all those sort of things that become rules. But what I was trying to do, which worked extremely well in terms of the values, was remove the language of not being able to do things and replace them with a sense of responsibility. So, being thoughtful was walking along the corridor without making a noise. So we would have the impact of what rules were trying to say in a kind of negative way. Don't do this, don't do that. To turn it around to say, well, we all have a sense of responsibility in the school to each other, and the way that we can all live together really nicely is through a positive thinking process, allowing us to think, what are the consequences if I don't live by the values?
And because they're your values anyway, right? You're the one who's voted on them.
Exactly.
So you've introduced the language. So the hesitation then, I suppose, for a head teacher or an SLT team might be, we wouldn't know how to do this. And I suppose that's where your guidance and maybe frameworks can become important.
Yeah.
And the work that you're doing with the Bristol School. Being able to have some gentle frame. You don't just go crazy. You don't just wake up and it's the start of it's September 2026 and it's new term and just go like, right, no rules. We're going to start from there. There are actually certain frameworks.
Yes, no, and it took 2 or 3 years to work with a staff team to develop the common thinking that would allow us to move on to the no rules thing. But the values are the rules. The values are the rules, but the values are the rules expressed positively rather than negatively.
And the internal values.
And right? the specific contextual, yes. Yeah.
So rather than it being an externalized role, somebody's telling me what to do, it's actually, it almost becomes you as a child or as a part of this community, you feel a certain dissociation with yourself because this has become part of who I am. It's an identity. Because you've been part of this process.
Yes, and I also, in moving to the values approach, I also thought it would mimic the outside world a lot more. So we're preparing them for the outside world, rather than then thinking, I'm coming to school and there's a whole new set of rules I have to learn. Yeah, we just learn the world rules, the living in our world rules, rather than a separate set.
I see so many applications for this, Marcelo. Yes, there is the application in the classroom, but there is possibly, because one of the things, even just this, yesterday actually, I was in a meeting and with the school governor, and one of the things that they said was, the problem is the parents. And, something like this, kind of having frameworks where even parents are getting involved in the process. Means the whole community is involved in the process, but it's also something that they can use at home.
Yes,
so the children
absolutely.
are hearing it at home.
Yes.
They're hearing it at school. It's also something that could be introduced in different workplaces. So when you come from, school and you go into tertiary education, you find it there. When you come from tertiary education, you go into workplace, you find it there. There's so many applications for this. If there is a framework to follow, people don't have to spend years, trial and error.
Yeah, I've got amazing stories, Yvonne, as well, of how to make sure that the parents feel really, really valued and included within the school community. I developed the idea of the thinking blackboard in playgrounds. It's called Thinking in Playgrounds. And I developed the idea of every morning, as the parents and the families would come in with their children for start of school, there would be a big blackboard in the playground with an open-ended thinking question, challenge, and chalk out there. So all the families would come in with their children and engage in that open-ended challenge, and we used to love it so much. And they used to say that's such a valuable moment for us to be part, thinking with our children, being together, feeling part of the school. It was really, really amazing. So the partnership with parents was really, really key to setting these cultures.
I can see as well how this could be engaged in a tech world now that parents open email. A school could start with a thinking, every school day.
Exactly.
In secondary school, a lot of parents don't feel part of the school. So it could be a little poll or something that goes out and it's thinking question, and everybody just, you kind of turn it into something where they can respond, and then, they can build into, that's a beautiful thing.
And that's that's the idea that I started to develop with the children in the classroom, and it became known as, it's my first ever book called Start Thinking. So these are a set of challenges that the children come into every morning in the class. They have an open-ended challenge to do. That's the first thing that greets them, which is so fantastic. So that's day 2 of the Learning to Learn week. They learn all about those. So you can see how the Learning to Learn week starts to establish and introduces them to all these amazing things that I just think it makes school something they look forward to.
It makes sense. It makes sense to be part of the school culture, and I mean, I want to go into every single day, and we, I think there's something exciting to come out of this, where this can be developed as a way in which the whole country, picks this up, and a lot of teacher training colleges, for example, introduce it. But I've got one thing. If you were to just one question for you. If you could change one thing about how teachers start the year, what would it be for you?
I would say to establish formally a whole school learning to learn week. I think it would transform, and I've got so many quotes from head teachers who are doing this, of how it's transformed the way that the staff feel, the children feel, the parents feel about education. So I would, and in the latest curriculum reform that the government have just gone out to everyone, that was the suggestion I introduced. I wanted, I think it'd be a dream if all schools launched with a learning to learn week. But like you're saying, lots of schools do something, don't they? That kind of sense of introductory days. Every school does something, but I think what is really exciting about the Joint Learning to Learn week is that it's very structured and very kind of based on equipping them with specific skills that are known to then help them become effective learners.
Exactly. Yeah. It's having a framework. Yeah, because exactly. Once a framework is established, it becomes something. I mean, there's the saying that when something is written, it becomes part of history. So, and it becomes part of the everyday. Before we were able to write things down, we just kind of did things, and then we're able to write down, and progress then started from there, right? So there was the development of reeds, and then people were writing on reeds, and then they developed the alphabet, and so all that kind of thing. So I think this is where this is powerful, is having that framework. So,
but to answer your question a little bit more precisely, Yvonne, one thing if I had to pick one thing from the whole week,
I was going to ask you as well,
is the individual models of learning that every child creates. I can't tell you how transformational in terms of their lives they have become, because the teacher then uses the language of the models to chat with every child about their learning throughout the year. So it becomes a personalized approach to feedback, and it becomes a really, in terms of how a child feels valued as a learner, they are so transformational. They have changed. Got lots of stories of how they've actually changed children's lives. As soon as they create their model and they talk about it, and the teacher uses them to enable them to succeed, they are, and they're great fun to create. So that's the one thing I would say is the one that stands out for me in devoting the first week.
The first week. Oh, that's beautiful. Let's pull 3 takeaways. Let's be more generous than just one. So 3 takeaways from today, because there's so many. I mean, I was scribbling. I mean, I've got a full page, and I could keep going because it's so fascinating. I actually stopped writing and just started listening. But the 3 takeaways I've taken from today. So the first week, it's not just admin. It's actually a cultural design. So it's not a teach-off exercise, which is a lot of things that we do in education. It's actually a different way of thinking. It's a cultural design. The second one is students need to learn how to learn, not just what to learn. And that first week is about modeling that. We're all learning, right? And this is how we learn. And then we can introduce, this year we're going to be doing this. And I love that, what you introduced there, this is how a mathematician thinks. This is how a literacy, thought leader thinks. This is how an economist, I teach economics, so this is how an economist would think. And then the third takeaway is calm classrooms come from systems, not constant correction. So those students not lining up, outside the head teacher, because the system had been introduced into the whole school in how to think. This is fascinating, and so here it is. Then we always end with our one big change. what would you say, in your opinion, Marcelo? What is one thing you would encourage everybody listening to this and thinking, I want to redesign my first week? What is the
Mm.
one thing you could say you need to have this? I know that's a big
Yes,
one.
yes.
Yeah,
Apart from the concept of thinking
yeah,
how to structure that first week, I
yeah.
think one really exciting thing that all teachers listening, I would love them to have a go at, is to change or to transform the learning objective into a can we question,
Mm,
and if possible also into a philosophical question that then enable them to launch every lesson with a fascinating inquiry discussion where you get to know and see what children's interests are, their current knowledge, their passions, and also their misconceptions. So, for example, the example we were talking about earlier on, do two-dimensional shapes exist as a way into teaching two-dimensional shapes, is fascinating because I don't think they exist. You can't hold one, you can't touch one, you can't, they don't exist, do they? But we study them, we've got names for them, we call them circles, triangles, squares, rectangles. We look at their properties, but they actually don't exist. So in having that conversation is an amazing way in to motivate the children with that passion for learning, for wanting to engage, for seeing, and introducing lots of, philosophy comes with a lot of humor in the classroom because these questions are very, they are very funny questions.
and actually giving permission to have fun. That's powerful, though.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, and that's something every teacher can do, isn't it? That's something we all do. We all have learning
Hmm.
objectives, and it's a little bit of a thought on that, on the way we structure that learning objective, and how it even just changes our thinking in the
Hmm.
classroom, the students' thinking. Okay, so yeah, that's a powerful one big change. Yeah, so when you're redesigning that first week, as you're writing down your learning objectives,
Hmm.
just maybe redesign the learning objectives. That's a
Yeah.
start. That's it.
Yeah.
Don't wait that you
Yeah.
don't have this as a whole school
Yes.
culture. The head teacher would never introduce this.
Mm.
This is something that gives you a little bit of agency, right? You
Exactly.
can actually do something with it.
Exactly. And I'm very happy to offer, Yvonne, anybody that wants to carry on the conversation um, along any of these topics. I'd be absolutely delighted for anyone to get in touch. We can work on things together. I'd absolutely would be delighted with that.
Yeah, and that's such a generous offer. Marcelo, wow, wow. How time flies when you're having fun. You've left me, just like the topic says itself, you've left me with so many questions now. And
Good.
I'm fascinated. I want to learn more. I think there's so much and we're definitely going to do a lot of things together. I can just see because there's so much excitement in the whole of this. But before we finish, our last segment is normally titled the quick star or rapid fire section. So we just ask
Hmm.
you one question, and I know you don't like rules, my fellow. So there's only one rule for this one. um, say the first thing that comes to mind. But I think you like the second part of this because there's no right or wrong answer.
Oh, that's good.
Okay, so are you ready to play the quick star?
I'd love to, yes.
Fantastic. So the first question coming from me, tea or coffee or even something stronger, and how do you take it?
Black coffee.
Black coffee. Anybody listening? And I know lots of people will be reaching out to you. Remember that you're going out there to buy Marcelo a coffee. He has his black. Don't be putting any sugar in there. Don't be putting
No.
any milk. Fantastic. Okay, a daily ritual that keeps you grounded.
Um, Going for a run?
5K, 10K, marathon?
I did 10 on Saturday, but
Wow, I've
usually
never been
shorter
able to
one.
do a
Usually
10K. I'm
shorter.
always very fascinated when you can. So how do you have a best time? Do you time it?
I'm about 7 minutes per K. Quite a slow
Oh,
pace.
wow, that's good though. That is
It's
really
quite a
good.
slow pace, but I do enjoy it, and it that just sense of. I mean, I play lots of tennis as well, but not obviously not daily. But those two things that keep me entertained. And actually, the answer to that question, Yvonne, is from May to September.
Hmm.
It's a daily swim in the sea. I start every morning with a little dip in the sea in Brighton.
Wow, the
So
English
that's
sea
more
is
of a daily
cold, even
one that
in
you were saying.
summer. Hats
Yeah,
off.
yeah.
Oh, wow, well done. Okay, one connection that changed everything for you.
That's really interesting. Is when I met a person called John West Burnham very, very early on in my career.
Mhm.
Completely changed my whole way of thinking, my whole aspect, my whole view of education, my whole view of life. And yeah, I owe him so much. Unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago. But his work is the legacy that he's left is incredible. It's called John West Burnham, and we
Mm.
now have the John West Burnham Legacy Group, and we have an annual lecture. So I can invite you to the next one, Yvonne.
Yes, please. I'd love to come, and we're eternally grateful to him, because through that you've written all these books and
Hmm.
put all this framework,
And
which
we
I
wrote a
think.
lot together as well. Yes, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. A piece of tech that you might believe brings people together, or actually brings people closer, which I think is the same, right? Yeah.
A text.
Tech, like technology.
Oh, technology.
Mm.
Well, at the moment, LinkedIn would be my first answer.
Yeah.
I'm doing a huge amount of work internationally at the moment with Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan,
Mm.
and LinkedIn brings us together. Yes.
Ah. LinkedIn. A quote or mantra that you live by.
Um, I never teach my students, I just provide the conditions in which they can learn. Albert
Okay.
Einstein.
Albert Einstein. I never teach my students. I just provide
The
an environment,
conditions
the
in which they can
conditions
learn.
in which they learn. Fantastic. Okay, something people would be surprised to know about Marcelo.
I was born in Buenos Aires in Argentina,
Hmm.
and I came over when I was 11.
I was surprised to learn about that because you do not sound Argentinian at all. The completely British accent.
Thank
So yeah, yeah. Okay, if this season had a theme song, what would your theme song be for this season in your life?
A song.
Yeah.
There's a song called Gracias a la Vida,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
means
Thank
thanks
you
to
for that.
life. And that's my
Thank
kind of
you.
anthem. It's by a wonderful singer in South America, and she's Argentinian, called Mercedes Sosa. And the song Gracias a la Vida is like an anthem in Latin America. It's so beautiful,
Mm.
Yvonne, and it just gives thanks to everything that we have in life.
I know Perpetual will be sending that to me. I always love to find out new songs.
It's beautiful, yes.
Yeah, it sounds beautiful as well. Well,
Mm.
Marcelo, thank you so much for this one. And I have to say, this one for me, I have learned already so much. I can already see this applying to my life. And
Hmm.
I can also see how this can apply to every teacher. That's one simple thing
Hmm.
you can do.
Hmm.
Just change that learning objective question
Hmm.
and start in a way that brings everybody into the learning objective.
Hmm.
Everybody can do that.
Yeah.
And also because that first week, whatever we do as educators, it will echo through the whole year. Um, but there isn't a framework. There's always that conversation. Make sure you put them up in the first week, but there's no. This is how you do it. This is how
Yeah.
long you do it for.
Yeah.
And you've put in place. This is what you do day 1, day 2, day 3.
Yeah.
And then this is
Yes,
how you then.
and the book it's got 2 chapters on it, so
Yeah.
and hundreds of ideas to
Yeah.
pick from to do each day. Yeah.
So anybody that joined partway through, we will be sharing a replay of today's episode, and we post it on YouTube every Tuesday at 11:45. So don't worry if you didn't if you didn't join right from the start, or if you haven't watched this as we're watching it, we will share it. Because I think this will be really useful for the next planning phase and next planning session. Don't forget your one big change, because in the classroom, some of the biggest shifts actually happen, with just one little thing, that one first lesson. Marcelo, where can we find you? Where can we find more information? Where can we connect with you?
Well, on LinkedIn.
LinkedIn.
You can find me on LinkedIn. But on my email as well, you can share. You just search and share at the University of Sussex. My email. I'd be delighted to get in touch with everyone. I also have a website called jonklearning.co.uk. And if anybody wants to acquire a signed and dedicated copy of the book, I'd be delighted to get in touch.
Fantastic.
So please do.
And I am very sure we will definitely be bringing you back to, if you will accept.
There's so much more I'd love to share with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us, Marcelo. It's such a shame we have to let you go, but we will definitely keep in touch. For our viewers, next Thursday, same time, same kitchen. And until then, stay connected, stay human. Remember, it's not about doing more, it's about connecting better. Thank you so much. Bye for now.
Thank you, Yvonne.
Standing in the Hall of Fame. Yeah.